Welcome everyone to Backyard Composting 101. We're just getting set up on site and Muriel will begin speaking to you in just a minute.
I'm ready if you are.
Okay, let's go.
Is the camera flipped?
Yeah.
Okay,
I
terrific.
had it pointed away.
Okay, wonderful. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Muriel Williman. I'm the Assistant Solid Waste Manager for the City of Durham Solid Waste Management Department. I have been teaching this class for over 20 years, not in this incarnation, but in Orange County as their Education Outreach Coordinator. But composting has been in my blood since I was a kid. I'm really glad that you're all here, and thank you to Mariel, Klein from the manager's office, and to Tania Dautlick for co-hosting this with me. Doing it live is the best way that we could try to capture the spirit of other classes where people could, chime in with their questions and it could be interactive. And so we're trying this new method on Zoom, and we appreciate you for joining in the experiment. This is actually the second time that we've taught this class, so we got some technical bugs out of the system. We are recording, so hopefully this will be good enough to show for people that are interested at a later date. At any rate, we got some questions. We got some awesome questions from the participants today, a wide variety. Everybody was interested in the basics, also how to grow a compost if you only have a little bit of stuff, how to make more compost, how to get more people involved, community composting. Someone is visiting here from a church, from their church group, and wants to get the sort of faith-based community involved, which is wonderful. So let's get started with the basics. Why compost? There are so many reasons. I know when I was growing up, my mom was a big-time gardener. She had 2 green thumbs, and I grew up with what's called the ditch method. She had about 1/8 of an acre garden with ditches on either side. And one ditch would be fallow with the previous year's organic, vegetable scraps and so forth in it. And the other one would be active, and we'd be putting our scraps into that ditch. And then at the, when it was full, that one would be covered. In the spring, she would dig up the fallow ditch, put it in the garden, and then that one would be active and this one would be fallow, and she rotated the organics into the garden that way. This is in upstate New York, where the alluvial soils are very deep, very rich in mineral content already, so that organic addition made incredibly fertile soil, and she grew enough food to feed a family of 5. A lot of wonderful fresh vegetables. The most delicious strawberries I still have had to date were ones that she grew. So I knew, I learned how to make nutritious soil at her knee. I like to say everything I learned about dirt, I learned from my mother. And I mean, my mother, my birth mother, but also my earth mother. So I become a gardener myself. I go into the environmental studies program at SUNY Binghamton, and I learned how to compost indoors from a friend who gave me a handful of worms. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later too. But, my interest there was getting food out of the waste stream. Landfills I knew were a big problem. For the environment, and the wasteful practices of Americans are really getting to me personally. So here's my career in garbage. Anyway, so my interest was multifold, and keeping my hands in the dirt. Even though I lived in an apartment, I could still be making beautiful compost from the food waste instead of throwing it out. So in that spirit, I have I think that that's some of the basic interests that people have. Number one, maybe they're not even interested in the compost. They just don't want to be throwing away food waste. And that's where services, curbside collection services like Compost Now, they come in to very handy, because they can bring the waste to a commercial composting company. You know that it's not going into a landfill. It's making rich soil that maybe someone else can use. And that's very, totally legitimate. You can make your own compost, and even if you don't use it, you can offer it to friends. But getting that food waste out of the waste stream is really important. In fact, the city of Durham, and I'm going to refer to this schematic back here. The city of Durham did a waste characterization study about 5 years ago, and in that they learned that about 30% of the waste that Durham residents throw away is compostable. 20% of that is food waste. So if we just reduced our food waste, we would reduce our impact on landfills tremendously. You know, that it's the heaviest component of the waste stream. And so, you know, we reduce the cost of hauling our garbage to Sampson County. We would reduce the weight of our trucks going, you know, up and down the street collecting garbage. There's transportation impacts that just to start out. And then when you get to the landfill, food waste, when it breaks down without oxygen, which is what happens in a landfill, it produces methane, which is the most potent of the greenhouse gases, and it breaks down and produces leachate. And so the liquid breaking down in food waste actually picks up particles and, you know, is part of the landfill management. They have to manage the methane and they have to manage the leachate to make sure that it's managed appropriately within EPA guidelines, state guidelines, and so forth. So nothing is more regulated in this country than a landfill. And one of the reasons for that is the volatility that food waste inside it adds. So if we take that out, we are benefiting the atmosphere because we're taking methane out of the air, and we're also benefiting you know, reducing the volatility of the leachate that's coming out of it as well, and reducing costs for your community, for that community, because they don't have to manage the leachate that's coming out of the landfill. So then if you're keeping your food waste out, maybe you're not even composting, but you're just thinking about smart shopping practices. Think about how you can reduce waste in the first place. The waste characterization study for a city, you know, you put on the Tyvek, you paw through the garbage, you see what's recyclable, you see what's not, and you see what's left. And if you do that in your own household, you may realize that, you know, you're shopping more, you're buying more than you can possibly get rid of in a week. Maybe you could plan your meals so you know what you're going to use, what night, and if you miss a night or something, then it's not an entire batch of groceries that goes to waste. There's also a great website, the Natural Resource Defense Council has infographic about how to use your refrigerator. And I learned so much about how to properly preserve fruits and vegetables just by setting my crisper drawer appropriately. I'm a grown woman and I did not know how to operate my own fridge. So learning how to keep foods fresh longer will also reduce food waste. Shopping smarter is better. If you don't, then you can compost. And then there's a whole host of other benefits to composting. You can make your own rich soil amendment if you're a gardener, or even if you just have patio plants or windowsill plants, you can make your own garden mix with the compost that you make inside or outdoors, which I'll talk mostly about today. So outdoors, compost is, I mean, it's not a silver bullet. It kind of is, because it can fix just about any soil problem you've got. If you've got sandy soil, it'll help it clump together, so it reduces water from just washing through. So it'll help your soil retain moisture. More often than not around here, at least in my yard, I have clay soil. And so the compost helps break apart that clay. You want to have that mineral content. Plants like a mix of organic and mineral content. You need it for the nutrients, certainly. But you know, compost can bring a sandy soil into a more moisture containing and get a clay soil to be more draining. Not only that, a pH of a compost is right about at neutral. So if you've got an acidic soil or an alkaline soil or even a blend, your compost is going to bring that pH closer to what most plants like, a nice neutral pH. So not a silver bullet, but pretty darn good. So if you come, I should say I'm here at the Solid Waste Management Department Administrative Office building, and I built this composting demonstration site in the hopes of teaching classes just like this. And it is mirrored. There's a couple of them in Orange County. Wake County also has similar composting demonstration sites. The schematic shows the basics of composting, and no matter whether you're composting indoors using worms or outdoors using a variety of recipes, there are only 4 basic ingredients: carbon, nitrogen, water, and air, and that is it. So people think like, oh, it's so complicated. Well, there's really just 4 basic ingredients. So whenever I'm talking about composting, I always like to start out with my worm bin because it's just this encapsulation of indoor composting. And it's the encapsulation of the 4 basic elements of any composting. Oh, I should also add, I was talking about using using composting as a soil amendment. Tania's going to drop in the chat a link to the North Carolina Composting Council's flyer. 10 uses, I think it's to improve your soil, 10 uses of compost to improve your soil, something along those lines. So it's a great little 1-page guide. The ratio of soil to compost, you really don't want to use more than 30% compost in your soils, generally speaking, but all that is in a nice 1-page guide. Full disclosure, I'm actually on the board of the North Carolina Composting Council, so I am definitely in favor of the work that they do. If you want to buy extra compost to enhance your soil because you're just getting started with the backyard composting scene, then they have a map online too where you can actually buy compost that's made locally. So anyway, to the worm bin. So here we go. This is an indoor worm bin that I keep in my office. And of course, the first thing that people say when I tell them that I'm composting indoors, well, can you imagine? They say, oh, gross, it must stink. Or, oh my gosh, the bugs, right? Well, full reveal. We ready for this, Mariel?
Yeah.
That's it. So no bugs. You
I
didn't
don't see
see a
one
single
bug.
You didn't see a single bug fly out. All we see is newspaper on top. So this is my carbon source for my worm bin. And so I'm gonna just grab a handful of this, and we didn't rehearse this, but I can tell you it doesn't.
Smells great.
It hardly has any odor at all. I would point it to Mariel, but she's got a mask on, so
Can't smell through that.
so that won't work. But I can tell you this is virtually odorless. If I really get in there and get a big whiff of it, it's got a slightly, earthy aroma, but there's absolutely no smell. And I can tell you that I've been feeding this for years. This is a very mature worm bin, and there are absolutely thousands and thousands of worms in here. Another time we can teach a workshop about worm composting. They do a great job. Look at this gorgeous, rich compost. So not all composts are created equal. I'll talk about that in just a minute. Back to the 4 ingredients: carbon, nitrogen, water, and air. So in my worm bin, I use carbon as my, I use newspaper as my carbon source. It's an indoor system. I like it because the fibers are really small and it breaks down really quickly. One of the main things about composting is density and moisture of material. So that moisture content, I mentioned water also is one of the 4 ingredients. What you want, whether you're composting indoors or out, is what they call 70% saturation. That's pretty wet. It's about the same wetness as a wrung out sponge. And so this is a little dry. Actually, maybe I should have spritzed it this morning. But you can see if it was 70%, it would actually be not dripping, but I would be able to squeeze it and droplets of water would come out. So you always want to have a water source handy when you're composting because you need to add that extra moisture. So that's what I'm talking about. About 70% saturation where the water is dripping if you give it a good squeeze, and but not soupy. If it's soupy, then you don't have your other ingredient, air, right? So you need to have this moisture content with air inside, and carbon creates the structure and porosity that holds those air pockets. So even though this compost, as you can probably tell from looking at it, is wet, if I gave it a good squeeze, God bless you, if I gave it a good squeeze, I would probably get some moisture droplets out of it. You can tell how wet it is just by looking. So we've got that 70% saturation, but look how crumbly it is. Look how crumbly it is. And I don't know if you can see on the camera, but there are even little newspaper fibers inside. So those newspaper fibers are holding up the air, even though it's wet. There's all kinds of little critters in here too. There's a little spider mite, and here's a little baby earthworm. So, you know, if you feed them, they will reproduce. And so, like I said, there's probably thousands of earthworms in here, and they do more of a biological composting where they eat the organic scraps. And, you know, for my worm bin, you know, here's what's left of a tea bag. You know, I feed it kitchen scraps, you know, banana peels, apple cores, coffee grounds, you know, fresh stuff right off my cutting board. And that is the nitrogen source. That is the energy source. And so the worms eat the nitrogen and they hang out in the carbon. Eventually they'll eat it. You know, it does break down. But the carbon is really necessary for that porosity. If I was just throwing nitrogen in here, it would be soupy. And without that air, it would be stinky too. It would go anaerobic. And what anaerobic decomposition means is that you have that smell. So if you're throwing away your food waste and your trash bag has a bad smell because of the rotting food inside, it's because it's breaking down without oxygen. When you take that food waste out and you put it in a compost pile, you add that air and you have aerobic decomposition that doesn't smell. So there are some exceptions, of course, which I'll get into more, you know, that things that can cause odor. But when I first opened up this worm bin, you noticed that all the carbon was sitting on top. It was wet, wet, wet. And that's to prevent any airborne organisms from coming and setting up a nest. I don't want fruit flies. I don't really want house flies. I really don't want any flies. You know, they don't hurt me or anything like that, but they are annoying and they are kind of pesty. So if you cover your compost with a wet layer of carbon, then you're going to reduce flies by a tremendous amount. In my indoor worm bin, 100%. There were no flies whatsoever. You might get a few flies in your backyard bin, depending on the type of container that you use, but that is one way to really suppress any flying organisms. So that's the indoor bin, that's the encapsulation, carbon, nitrogen, water, air. So we can move to the outdoor area now. I'm gonna stop and take a little break and check in and see. This format's a little weird because I can't hear you, I can't see you. I'm just kind of winging it on this side. I'm judging how I'm doing by Mariel smiling.
We don't have any technical questions yet, but I have posted a few links in the chat regarding worm composting. And as Muriel said, we'll be focusing on backyard composting from now on, but we'll follow up with a workshop on worm bin composting in the future. We do have one question. What is the better choice for waste not being composted? Sending it to the landfill or using a garbage disposal in the sink?
Do you mean
question?
If you mean food?
So if you're throwing food waste away and not composting it, is it better to put it down the disposal or to throw it in the trash?
That's really funny. I think it depends on who you're asking. So water management, if you're putting it down the food disposal, it's going to water management. So this is a great segue to what the city of Durham is doing with composting. So right now, all of the biosolids, that is the leftover dewatered waste that comes from people's homes, both from their food disposals in their sinks and their toilets. All of that gets processed by our water management department, dewatered, and those biosolids, up until just a few months ago, much of them were being land applied on agricultural fields around the state. But now the city is incorporating all of their yard waste compost with the biosolids and making a Class A compost. That Class A just means that, you know, it's reached heat sufficient to eliminate pathogens, and you know, it's been composted in compliance with regulations, and so it can be used on any agricultural application, your backyard garden or a field that's growing pumpkins for Halloween, you know, or, you know, that's growing hay for horses. So a Class A compost is an upgrade from the biosolids that ordinarily would have been very costly to bring to to a field somewhere in North Carolina. So I dare say now, if you're choosing between your disposal and the landfill, go for the disposal because it will in fact be composted by the city. Awesome.
Good question.
Great question. So since Tania did put the links in, I do want to mention that the worms that I have in here are a special species of worms. They're Acenia fetida, composting worms. They don't burrow. They're not like night crawlers that you get at a bait store. So you want to make sure that you're getting your composting worms from a worm dealer. And I think that's one of the links that she put in, New Soil Vermiculture. They're a Durham-based worm grower and just wonderful, wonderful local entrepreneurs that are really into vermicomposting. If you're composting indoors, get the right kind of worms. Don't be fooled by the red wigglers at a bait shop. They're red, they wiggle. They may not be the same as the little composting worms that are very effective in living in a small container like this. When you're composting outdoors, though, you do not need to add worms. If you feed them, they will come. So another segue.
Muriel, we have one more question about worms in the outdoor bin. Will they make your worms that come naturally into the outdoor bin? Will they make it through the winter, or should something be done to help protect them from the cold?
They know how to take care of themselves.
They're big worms.
They can. I mean, that's a great question. But if you want to do vermiculture outside, then you know, that's a little different than actually having an outdoor bin that will attract worms. Because frankly, I don't want to attract worms to my outdoor bin. I want a hot compost. And so that's what outdoor composting is really about, is being able to have a chemical reaction with the carbon and the nitrogen so that you get a heat surge. And it'll really, in the center where it's getting really hot, it'll be too hot for worms, but it's still breaking down very effectively. Worms will stay around the perimeter if it's too hot. If it gets too cold, they'll go down beneath the surface. But if you're creating a warm compost that's maybe not super hot, super active, they'll be able to stay inside the worm bin or stay inside the compost and be eating the nitrogen there. But honestly, it's like, you know, they'll come and go. You know, if they don't come back again until the weather warms up, then you haven't been doing anything wrong. I hope that helps. But let's talk more about the outdoor chemical. It's more of a, you know, a chemical reaction, like a bioreactor that you can do with outdoor composting that I think is so much more magical and effective because you can really tackle a lot more different kinds of waste. My worm bin is very, very picky. I don't put, I mean, fresh off the cutting board, that's pretty much what they get right out of the coffee pot, that's it. But my outdoor worm bin, I keep saying that, my outdoor composter is so much more forgiving. And with that heat surge can handle a lot of different kinds of waste that otherwise might be problematic. So those four basic ingredients, again, carbon, nitrogen, water, air. This is the demonstration site, unfortunately, is placed right now where there isn't a hose. So I actually had to bring buckets of water. I recommend if you're setting up a backyard compost that you set it up where you can drag a hose to it. This is not a whole lot of fun. But if it's necessary, if that's what you need to do, we also want to just put a rain barrel here. So when we install the rain barrel, we'll have a party, we'll have another composting class or something like that. And we'll water the compost ceremoniously. Let's see, let me start at the top. Let's go with carbon. So this time of year, it's fall. It is the time to be collecting your carbon. So right here with a backyard bin, excuse me, eating my own hair, also compostable, but not very tasty. So now that it's fall, now's a great time to be collecting your brown leaves. I live in Northgate Park, and if you live in Durham, you know that the national tree of Durham is the willow oak. They were planted back in the 40s and 50s, and there are a great many of them in our beautifully tree covered city. And so this is from my backyard. This is actually just off my back porch that I collected just a couple days ago for this class. So they're really prolific. These brown leaves I'm going to store in a wire container so that I have them all year long. I'm going to be producing a lot of more nitrogen waste from my garden, from, you know, the farmer's market. Come spring, you know, we start to get all these really juicy fruits and vegetables. Right now it's more like winter crops, root crops, and collards and things like that. They're a little bit more sturdy. So you definitely want to have a good carbon component to help break them down. One of my favorite composting all-stars in the state of North Carolina, Frank Franciosi, I actually heard him speak once a long time ago. He said that nitrogen is the fuel that burns the carbon. So you want to have a good balance of both. You can't do compost, you can't do anaerobic compost without carbon. You need it for that structure and for porosity, and you also need it for that volatility to break down with the nitrogen. So I like to try to bring together carbon and nitrogen in other forms, but with a backyard compost, probably the most likely source of nitrogen that you're going to have is your kitchen scraps. So I went to Weaver Street Market in their produce department. All they do is prepare produce for the sales floor. And so I go to the produce department. They know me by now. And I just tell them that I'm going to be teaching a composting class. And
They're so good.
okay. And they set aside their veggie scraps for me, and I can go pick them up. So this is something that I picked up on Sunday. And so a lot of the literature that you will see says that nitrogen are greens. And as you can see, this is all nitrogen, but it's not all green. We've got a yellow banana. We've got these purple onion skins, purple kale. And you know, this is all beautiful nitrogenous waste, a red apple. So when you see the greens, it's not all green. It just means that it is fresh vegetative material. So this has been out here since Sunday. And as you can see, it's already attracting fruit flies and other kinds of critters. And this is not what I want. It's wide open, it's uncovered, it's not mixed with any carbon. And I'm also flinging around this compostable plastic bag that it's in. This is not going to break down very well in my backyard compost. So I'm probably just going to actually throw this plastic film away. Even though it says it's compostable, it's really designed to break down in a commercial composting facility where they're very aggressive about churning it or aerating it and making sure that it's wet and that it gets that heat surge that's necessary to break down this material. They also have a much greater volume of material. In my little outdoor compost, I don't have that much volume. So I'm just going to keep this out. It's going to create a water barrier, and that's not what I want. I want the water, the carbon, the nitrogen to mix all together and make a beautiful buffet for the microorganisms and the macroorganisms like worms and hillbugs and things. So here's my greens. Very common mix for a backyard bin is your brown leaves from your yard and your kitchen scraps from your house. The other thing that you might want to put in with your brown leaves right now is a perfect time to be mulching. So a lot of people like to mow their grass with their first fall of leaves and put it together, and it makes an incredible compost mix. As a matter of fact, I thought that I was getting a bag of leaves from our yard waste facility. It looked like leaves on top, but as it turned out, it was an absolutely perfect mix of brown leaves and green grass. And I just had bags and bags of it. And so, like I said, see how moist that is? I've got 70% saturation. I've got a mix of carbon and nitrogen, and it feels warm to my touch. So this is actually already cooking. The nitrogen is the fuel that burns the carbon. And so this is literally breaking down right now. And I just put it together on Tuesday. It was Tuesday. So 2 days.
I can smell through the mask. It smells great.
It's got a kind of a grassy smell.
Mm-hmm.
So we're cooking it. At any rate, so a lot of the literature you'll see, brown carbon and green nitrogen, you want 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. And so when I first heard that, I was like, what? Carbon to nitrogen? Well, I know that carbon comes from brown leaves and nitrogen comes from my kitchen scraps. So I need 30 bags of leaves to 1 bag of kitchen scraps. That doesn't make any sense. I knew from composting with my mom that that didn't make any sense. So further investigation, I learned that it's a ratio. So even though these are, these are dry brown loaded with carbon, it's about 80 to 1 carbon to nitrogen. The grass is something more like 15 to 1 carbon to nitrogen. We're carbon-based life forms, right? So carbon provides the structure and porosity that makes me just as much as it does in the compost. So, the 30 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio is, that's fine. If you want to do the math, you can. But for me, I just think, well, about 50-50, depending on your inputs, about 50% by volume carbon, about 50% by volume nitrogen. It's going to vary depending on the density of the materials that you put in. It's going to depend on the moisture content. It's going to depend on how active you are with turning it. You don't have to turn a compost to make it hot. I just put my composting thermometer in here this morning. Can you get right down in there, Mariel?
Sure.
And so it's only been here for 2 days. I haven't turned it at all, but this beautiful mix of carbon and nitrogen, just about at 50-50 by volume. Well, I'd say maybe 60-40, 60% leaves, 40% grass. And it's in the hot business.
Wow. It's like 130 degrees.
Yeah, it's 130
Bake
degrees.
some
And we didn't,
cookies.
yeah, it's so I'm not going to put my hand in there because it's a little too hot. So remember the other ingredients are water and air. So this wire bin is fantastic for containing things. I'm not a huge fan of using these for composting though, because it lets in so much air. So this is breaking down. You see my thermometer is actually really long. And so this goes all the way down into the center of the pile. And that wet exterior, the water is going to go by gravity down into the center, down into the bottom. So the microbiome is going to be most active where it's wet. Bacteria lives in moisture. They will not survive in a dry environment. So this exterior that is getting all dried out is just going to mummify, and it's not going to do anything. So a lot of times you'll hear that you need to turn your compost. You're not actually turning it. I'm not going to take this, I can't, take this container and turn it around in a circle or anything like that. What it really means is that you're turning the dry exterior into the wet interior. So it's very much like baking a cake where you drop your eggs, into the center and you fold the dry flour and sugar into it. And so then all of the ingredients are incorporated together, and then you can, put it in the oven and make it hot and let it bake. But you need to have all of those ingredients mixed in together so that they're equally distributed and evenly coated. And that's a great analogy for composting. You want to have that moisture throughout. You want to have the carbon and the nitrogen mixed together. It's one of the reasons why this mulching style is so great, because you can literally see the grass sticking to the carbon on the leaves. And in a moist environment, this is going to be very rich for microbes. The exterior, however, is going to dry out. So I prefer a bin that maybe is a little bit more contained, which is why we also like these kind of containers. And this is actually the style that we're going to be giving off in a raffle. I call it the Darth Vader helmet style of composter. Very simple. It's open to the ground, and it's just essentially a plastic colander. But the benefit of it is that you can, put your mix of carbon and nitrogen inside, and that the moisture will sink down to the bottom. It'll stay composting down at the bottom, where there's that concentration of material. And then as you're still feeding the top with fresh material, you can eventually harvest finished material from this door that's down at the bottom. So I just put some mulch in there when we first put this site together. So this mulch is composted, and I could scoop that out and use it as a compost, I suppose. But really right now, what I want it to do is to hold down the weeds until I actually put a hot pile in here. And the recipe that I'm talking about, your kitchen scraps and your brown leaves, is a awesome, awesome recipe to put in here. Your mulched leaves and grass, mix them all together, works really well in here. One of the benefits is that it is very tightly contained and it'll reduce the evaporation of moisture. So you're not going to get a lot of evaporation off of this. It does have vents in it, and I'm told by the manufacturer that you know, it's the number of the vents and the size of the vents are correlated to the size of the container. So they've got them on both sides and on the back. And so that should be adequate aeration for you to get into the center of the pile. So there's going to be enough aeration depending on what you put in it, so that it shouldn't go anaerobic. There are other ways of adding air. The density of your carbon, you know, building that building block is going to create more air pockets. Also another reason why having enough carbon is really important. So these, we're going to raffle off a few of these with the survey at the end of class. So don't forget to fill that out if you're interested in winning one of these. And we're interested in what you think too. So, all right. So back to the ingredients. I'm kind of hopping around a little bit. There's so much to talk about. That's the way it goes. Live in action. So a lot of people ask, I'm going to talk about some problem materials. So a lot of people ask about pine needles. We do live in the pine state after all. So, so pine needles are very abundant, and frankly, they don't do real well in a compost. You know, this is mixed with brown leaves. I could try to mix it with grass or chicken or kitchen scraps, but you know, pine needles come from evergreens. They're actually really designed to resist decomposition. So, you know, they want to stay green all year. They don't want to break down, which is one of the reasons why pine straw makes such an excellent mulch. So I did get another bag of this before I realized that it was pine needles and not just leaves. And so I ended up just using it as a mulch around this compost site because I neglect it when I'm not teaching. And, you know, the weeds can really grow up around. So pine straw works really well as a mulch. It doesn't break down very well in a compost. You can put it in there, but you'll probably end up with compost and pine needles. You know, it doesn't hurt anything. It's very acidic, and you know, that can slow composting as well. So I tend to avoid it, but if you do have pine trees in your yard, you might just want to rake the pine needles up around their feet. You know, we get these really, you know, harsh ice storms, and the shallow roots of pine trees can be protected by a blanket of their own needles, and it'll also prevent little seedlings from propping up too. So, you know, other than that, I tend to avoid pine needles. Oh, but I used to live in a neighborhood called Dogwood Acres. It should have been called Pine Acres. I didn't have any deciduous trees in my yard at all, just pine, one dogwood. And so, you know, this time of year, I'd be driving around like, you know, in Carborough. I lived in Chapel Hill at the time, and you'd see a bag of leaves, a big maple tree in the center of the yard, and I would just go ahead and grab it and throw it into my trunk and take it home and put it in my wire bin so that I could store leaves all winter because I need them. And pine needles weren't going to get it. You know, you can get, if you know neighbors, if you don't have any brown leaves, I mean, no one's going to stop you if you grab a bag of leaves. You see they've got a beautiful oak tree or a beautiful maple tree, something like that in the yard. You do want to avoid walnut. Walnut is actually, does have a toxin in it that will reduce microorganisms from growing, which is great if you have furniture, but not that great if you have walnut in your compost. So maple or oak or something, you know, dogwood even, go ahead and grab those leaves and store them at your house because you're going to want them. Once you start composting, all of that organic waste that you see laying around, you're going to want to grab it and bring it home and start composting for your yard and garden like I do. So do be careful though. I am going to give just a word of warning. Like I said, you know, I got one of these yard waste bags and I thought that it had all brown leaves, and it was actually a mix of grass and leaves. That's not so bad, but sometimes there, you know, some people may have put their lumber in there. It might have you know, nails in it, or, you know, shingles, you don't know, or even just pine cones and other stuff that you don't want. So, you know, be careful when you stick your hand where you don't know, like make sure that there isn't anything in there that might actually harm you. The other thing about picking up random materials is you don't really know its source. So if that, you know, if that landscaper or homeowner used Roundup or some other herbicide or pesticide, you're actually bringing those chemicals into your compost. So that's why I like to look for just brown leaves, just from a tree that looks like it didn't have any other you know, chemical inputs. Most people don't spray their trees in their yard. Why would you? So, you know, it's generally chemical free and it feels safe to me. But it's best to know where your materials are coming from. You know, it's like know your farmer, know your compost additives too. If it's coming from your kitchen, then you know that it was food that you ate. It's probably safe. If it's, you know, coming from a stranger's house, you might want to consider having some care. Talk to your neighbors, see if they'll contribute some of their organics for your compost if you're really trying to build up a big pile. So other forms of carbon that you might want to use, you know, if you don't have brown leaves, you know, newspaper like I have in my worm bin is a good substitute. You want to shred it so that it's not a big mat like this, because this will actually, you know, prevent moisture from coming through. It'll suppress air. So you want to tear it and kind of fluff it up so it's more like a leaf instead of like newspaper. Oh, and just in, I mean, I'm older, so just to note that these inks back in the day, you know, red inks and things like that used to have lead and other heavy metals. There might be trace heavy metals in them now, but mostly it's soy-based inks, perfectly safe for a compost. And again, I like the shredded newspaper because it's got these short fibers. They break down really quickly. They work really well in a compost. Shredded paper, like from your tax, you know, tax bills or credit card offers, things like that, I'm a little bit more suspicious. I don't know where those dyes came from. And there's something about the bleach and the binding of white office paper that prevents it from breaking down. It really doesn't absorb water very well, and you can end up with a very pasty gray compost. I don't find it appetizing at all. I don't find it appealing, and I don't think the insects like it that much either. You may end up with it, you know, just attracting stuff that you don't want. So, so I would avoid office paper in your compost. If you must use paper, use newspaper. Better yet, use leaves. They've been scraped off the ground. They come from the tree. They have living organisms already on it. So you're inoculating your bin with that wonderful, diverse microbiome. Cardboard, also abundant. If you use it, please be advised that this is 500 to 1 carbon to nitrogen. So if you're going to use carbon, you better have a lot of nitrogen to break it down, and you're going to want to shred it also. And so that's not a whole lot of fun. But look at these crevices. This is just the kind of place where microorganisms like to hang out. They like that surface area. They like having, you know, different you know, spongy areas to hang out. So cardboard definitely has its place. I prefer to use it as a ground cover. So when I'm starting a compost bin, I will put cardboard underneath so it suppresses any weeds, it'll kill any grass that's underneath, and then you can put your compost on top. And it'll eventually break down. It's not going to hurt anything. It'll eventually dig down into the soil itself. But to start out, it's a great carbon contribution, and it'll help keep those weeds down as you progress with your compost pile. You do want to make sure that you get any stickers off, remove any tape, and make sure that it's just brown cardboard. On those lines, one of the problems with our grocery stores these days is that you know, we have these colorful plastic stickers. Unfortunately, they are made of plastic. Why would you put an organic or an organic onion a plastic sticker? It's just, we're just messed up kids. That's all there is to it. So take the stickers off your produce so that it doesn't end up in the compost. All right, let's see, where are we now? Carbon, nitrogen, yes, more mixes that you can find. So I've been at this for a while. So I'm always looking for different carbon nitrogen mixes. Coffee grounds and coffee filters are a great addition to your compost. And it just so happens that we have a few coffee shops One or
Just a
two?
few.
Just a few around town, and they're paying good money to get rid of that out the back door. No one's going to say, no, you can't have our coffee grounds. If you go and you ask nicely, a lot of places, they actually set it out and they may call it compost. It's not compost yet. Yes, it's brown. Yes, it's crumbly. Sure, it looks like dirt, but guess what? Smells like coffee. So this is not compost. You want a brown, crumbly, earthy aroma. This is a great compost additive though. So even though it's brown, don't be fooled. This is not carbon. This is nitrogen. It's a bean. It's been roasted, yes. And a lot of people think, well, it's coffee. It's so acidic. That acidity went into your coffee mug that you drank. The acidity has been removed from the coffee grounds. So this is an absolutely wonderful nitrogenous addition to your compost. And it is so, so, so abundant.
Excuse me, Muriel.
Yeah.
We have, well, one thing, the camera has sort of changed angles, and so you're on the side. So Mariel, if you could turn, yeah, there you go. And then related to materials, we have we have two questions. One is, how do eggshells fit into the materials? Are they compostable? And the other question is, can your container be in the sun or the shade, and does it matter?
Okay, I will get to both of those.
Okay.
Oh, it's 12:45.
12:45.
I know.
15 minutes. Oh my gosh. I haven't even gotten started. Okay. So great question. So eggshells are fine. They don't really decompose. It's more like they erode. So they will break down. They just sort of erode. They don't decompose the same way that the exterior of a cantaloupe does or something like that. But eggshells are great. They add calcium and other nutrients it's very rare in our soils here in North Carolina. So eggshells are an excellent addition. So I like to put my compost in my compost bin a little bit in the shade because the hot Carolina sun will dry out my compost in a red hot minute. So I will talk more about that in just a second. So the thing with the coffee and the filters together is that it's also wet, 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 right? It's been, the baristas have just been checking it and it's so loaded with moisture. So this bucket is actually super heavy because it's loaded with water down at the bottom. So next, I'm gonna just finish with the carbon nitrogen mix a little bit. So I put a warning label on this because even though we love to use manure, this is horse manure that I got from a horse farm. And I actually know this farmer. And I know that he doesn't use any herbicides or pesticides on his fields, but I don't know about the grain that he gives to his horses. And so there is a problem in compost, and it's called persistent herbicides. And it's not from the compost itself, it's from the inputs. And horse manure and other manures have been identified as being a source of the persistent herbicides. And what that means is that even when you break this down in a compost, that herbicide is still active. And you can imagine the heartbreak of a gardener that puts an herbicide in their garden completely unintentionally when they add compost that has had it in one of their inputs. So I say warning, do you want to use manures? Absolutely. The reason is because inside the horse's gut, there are thermophilic bacteria. Thermophilic means heat-loving bacteria. And so the nitrogen in the horse manure, it's about 20-to-1 carbon to nitrogen, it's loaded with nutrients and it's also got this heat-loving bacteria. So I'm going to inoculate my bin with bugs that like it hot and they keep it hot. And so I use manure as a compost accelerator. Because I'm concerned about persistent herbicides, even though I know my farmer is very he's sustainable and he likes to use organic methods, but he still has to order feed. And it's hard to follow that trail all the way to the beginning. Did anyone use persistent herbicides? I don't know. So the best way to make sure that those don't affect my garden is to only use a small amount, 8% or less in my overall recipe. I'm still going to be inoculating my compost with those wonderful thermophilic bacteria. The other thing is to wait. Let it compost, let it sit, let it cure, for a year or more. If your compost is going to sit for a while, then go ahead and use manure, or let the manure sit for a while and let that the herbicide age out, and then add it in a conservative amount to your compost. So just a word of warning. So the USCC, the U.S. Composting Council, is working really hard with the EPA to get persistent herbicides out of the compost stream, out of those feedstocks, really, and have more controls on it. But people are really waking up to it. If you're interested in that, the USCC has a great website. They'll be alerting members and others if you want to chime into the EPA about your concern about persistent herbicides, not just in our compost, but in our food stream. Let's see, in fact, there's going to be a conference coming up. The Carolina Farm Stewardship Association has a sustainable agriculture conference every year. This year it's on Zoom, and they will have a panel talking specifically about persistent herbicides because it is that much of a problem. People are really concerned, and they're active and trying to deal with that at the front end. Okay, so still a great compost additive because you know why? You've got the nitrogen from the horse manure and you've got the sawdust from the bedding. So not all compost is created equal. You saw that really dark, rich compost that I made with my worm bin. This is compost from my backyard composter. I used one of the Darth Vader helmet styles, and you can see how dark and rich it is. Still have some brown leaves in there, but it's kind of crumbly. We've got these small particles. Oh, and some insects, some pill bugs, lots of life in there. And then this is made from yard waste. This is a yard waste compost. So leaves and wood chips. And you can see that it's a much coarser. It's got more woody material. It's got a lot more aeration. So depending on the compaction of your soil, depending on what you're growing, you might want to use this compost more as a top dress because it can also act like a mulch. Whereas this is really loaded with the same nutrients from the food that I ate. And I want to put this back into my garden, down around the roots, down around the seed zone, where I'm going to grow food because they'll take up those nutrients that I ate, and I'll get those nutrients back into my body. There is no waste in nature. Everything is absolutely food for something else. So you have to put it where the microbes can break it down into a form where the plants can take it up. Another reason why I like these Darth Vader helmets is that you can actually use them to grow your garden. If you want to expand the space and you want to have a good rich soil there, just go ahead and move your Darth Vader helmet over where you want to have your garden. Put down your cardboard, start feeding it. And then, after, this is a long-term plan, right? So next season, maybe, you start it in the winter. By spring, you can pick it up and dish that in. Maybe not until fall, depending on what you put in it, depending how well it breaks down. You can dish that in and start your garden right away. You can move that bin wherever you want to expand your garden. However, for my demonstration, I like to use this 3-tiered system. So this is pretty classic compost demonstration site kind of bin, but it's also great if you have a lot of organic material that you're trying to break down. The way that this kind of container, if you will, works is that you build up your compost. In order to get a hot pile, you have to have a density of at least, the books say 3 by 3, but I found that 2 by 3 is generally effective to get that heat surge. But if you want to build your pile up, and then after a couple weeks, you can flip it into the next container, let it break down some more there, bring it up again, flip it. When it breaks down, it'll literally break down in volume also. So it's going to break down to a quarter its original volume. So even if you start with 3 by 3 here, after a couple weeks, it's going to sink down. You can flip it, build it back up. If there's stuff that you can still identify that's really not breaking down very quickly, keep it in the first bin before you turn it over. And all throughout, you can water. The problem with this container, of course, is that it is going to dry out. So you want to make sure that you have it somewhere nearby, a hose or some other way to keep it moist. So then you flip it, and then when you're ready to let it cure after a few months, you can put it in that last container. So for those of you that are interested in a community garden and community composting, this might be the style of container that you want to consider. If you're not a builder, if you don't have the construction skills to build this, that's fine. You can mimic it by using pallets and just have a pallet style bin where you have the pallets up on their edge, lash the corners with wire coat hangers, and create a cube. And you can add as many bays as you want or need to continue to flip your compost from one to another. And so this is very similar to that container where you've got the curing compost down in the bottom and you're adding fresh material to the top. Except it being in the vertical plane, here it is in the horizontal plane. You're adding your fresh material to the first zone, flipping it over and letting it fix more in the second zone, and then building this up with your raw material. And you can use this to make a very high volume of, to manage a high volume of organic matter, and also if you want to make a lot of compost. So for those of you that are really interested, I want to like be making as much compost, tell your neighbors, tell your friends, get a couple tiers going. Another way to mimic a 2-tiered system is to get multiple Darth Vader style and just have them side by side, and have one that's curing and have one that is, you know, having your fresh material, sort of like the rotation that I told you about with the ditch method. Some people like the churning units because they flip the material inside. I'm not a fan of them because what you're trying to do is create soil. So I prefer a container that is on the ground so that all those decomposers can come up through the soil. Microbes, worms, pill bugs, springtails. There's a whole diverse microbiome that will live in your soil and help break down those materials. The more
It looks like we've lost them for a moment.
diverse your feedstock, the more diverse your nutritive and your compost is going to be. So, you know, we're learning a lot about, you know, microbiology in our guts, and, you know, other places. I kind of feel diversity in the foods that we eat is reflected in the nutrition of our compost. So, why would you want to put your compost biodiversity? You know, they live in a chemically breaking down. If you put your compost out there, they will come. And especially if you've got a hot pile, then you're not relying on microbiology, although the thermophilic bacteria will reproduce in your hot center, and the gravity will pull that material down so that you've got a wet interior where the bacteria can live. They will thrive in a wet environment. They will thrive in a warm environment. If it gets dry and cool on the exterior, you're going to want to fold that in, water it down again to reactivate it. If it's still cool, then you have to add more fuel. You got to add more nitrogen, more fuel to the fire. If it's slimy and cold and has a bad odor, then you've got too much nitrogen. You have to add more carbon. So your compost will tell you what it needs once you start to listen. One of my favorite books, I'm not sure if I'm going to get to actually building the pile with this class. I'm really sorry, but one of my favorite books is this. It's a complete guide to compost gardening guide, and it's written by 2 women, and it's just a wonderful, they've got kind of a chatty style, and these women love compost. I love compost. They will compost in hay bales. They'll compost anywhere, whatever you got. Like, I thought I was weird grabbing bags of leaves off the street. They're like going to farmer markets. You got a hayride coming up in Halloween. They want that straw. So they're really into gardening and producing the food too. So this is an awesome, awesome guide. It's like nighttime comfort reading for some of us. So the next thing too is the tools of the trade. So some people like, well, I'm going to need a churning tool. If you have one of those churning composts, I don't mean to poo-poo it. You might just make sure that you have a good balance of carbon and nitrogen in it. And the thing too, when you're flipping it over like that and you're turning it, you're mixing the fixed compost with raw material. So you're never really going to get your fixed compost. You're going to really have to have 2 units or have a curing pile where you take out the semi-composted material and let it cure, and then have your raw material in the turning unit. So I prefer something where you can just do it in one place, but to each their own. And some people love them. So, you know, some people love them. But for turning compost, you know, I'm about 5 feet tall. So I like this, this modest sized turning fork. It's got these great space tines with flat surfaces so that you can really get in here and dig. And so I'm going to just show you, we did teach this class back in July. So the same ingredients that I just showed you, the bag of veggie scraps from Weaver Street Market, the bag of leaves from the yard waste collection, coffee grounds and coffee filters from the coffee shop, a bucket of manure, plenty of water, added it all together, mixed it all together, and this is what we got. So there's your friends, the worms. This looks like a composting worm to me, nice and skinny. Oh, sorry, buddy. But so this was here in July. I promise you, I did not do a thing to it. We just mixed it together and built it up, and this is what we got. And you can see that it's gorgeous. This brown crumbly material, I would be putting this in my garden right now if I had it at my house. But the other thing I want to point out too is that it is just loaded with life. It is absolutely loaded with life.
Yeah, look at all those
And
worms.
so, what we would have thrown out is actually food for other creatures. Now, these worms aren't just eating the rotting food. They're eating the bacteria that's eating the rotting food. So you can see the worms, but what you're not seeing is what they're gorging themselves on. So the microbiome here is very healthy. Some things that you do want to watch out for when you're composting is mold. It's a natural part of the decomposition process, but a lot of us have mold allergies. And if you're sensitive to that, you kind of want to avoid things that will mold or mildew. And bread and pasta, those fall into that category. So bread will mold in a minute. If you're throwing away bread, you might want to reconsider how much you're buying, but no judgment, but a heel here or there is not a big deal. You can put just about anything in your backyard compost, but make sure that you're thinking about the aeration. One mistake that I've made is rice. Can you compost rice? Of course, but don't just take the pot that was in the back of your refrigerator and chunk it in your compost and think that it's going to be okay. The wet starch holds moisture and no air, and it stank to high heaven. I mean, it smelled. And so break it apart, get some air in there, and make sure that it's mixed with a variety of other material, and your outdoor compost will be very forgiving. Some people ask, well, what about meat? Meat, bones, dairy products also have a very bad odor when they decompose. Meat will also attract other critters that you don't necessarily want for your compost. So some people are asking, how do I keep the critters out? So how much time do we have?
It's about 1 o'clock now.
Is it 1? That went so fast.
I know. Time flies when you're having fun.
Time flies when you're talking about compost. So I'm gonna,
What do we want to do?
Can people hang out for another 15 minutes?
I mean, we're recording this, so we can
Okay.
keep it going. If people need to leave, that's fine. And we
Okay.
can make the recording available so they can catch the tail end of this bit.
That's really smart. Thanks, Mariel.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So at any rate, so what was I saying? Oh yeah.
Meat.
Meat,
Critters out.
bones, critters. Yeah. So if you put the food scraps inside the pile and you've got a warm pile, it's going to discourage most critters from coming and dining on it. What it's going to attract is decomposers. Mice and rats, as pesky as they are, even opossums, they are not decomposers. They are scavengers. If you leave food on the surface, they may come by and grab it off the top. But if you cover it with carbon, if you have a good mix, if you have a hot pile, they're going to be disinterested. Meat and bones, things like that. Actually, what's more problematic from what I've heard is your dog. Your own dog in your own yard is going to chew apart your plastic composter and get into your compost and make a mess. So protect it from your own pets. But other than that, can you add meat, bones to your compost? Yeah. Will it break down? Sure. But you probably want to make sure that you have a really mature compost, that you're not just like trying to compost your chicken bones right off the bat. So, have a mature pile that has a very healthy microbiome. The reason that I know this, bone meal is sold in garden shops. Feather meal is sold. Blood meal is sold. All of these are really valuable ingredients for a healthy soil. You can really add a lot of nitrogen and other nutrients to your soil with these additives. So in your compost, the bones are going to hold up. They're not going to break down, but they will erode eventually. I I mean, you'll never see in any of the literature to add meat or bones or dairy. That definitely don't want to add dairy because it just stinks to high heaven. But I had a roommate actually who was Japanese American. He ate fish every day, and I couldn't stand having those fish heads in our garbage. So I put them in my compost. And the fish emulsion that you buy at the garden store is loaded with nutrients too. And so putting that in my compost, the microbes love that protein. It's just as valuable to the microbes as it is to us nutritively. And it was only a couple of days and the fish heads were gone. There was no sign of them whatsoever. And in their place is this beautiful, rich brown compost. So no matter where you are or what kind of food stock you've got, you can experiment. There's a lot of forgiveness in a backyard bin, especially if you have enough carbon. Carbon filters mask odors. Carbon in your compost will help suppress odors. Cover it up. If you pull the carbon back and you get a big whiff of something, you know that something's gone wrong, but guess what? You just added oxygen. So you just fixed the problem and you can get in there and find out what's going on. Maybe it's gone anaerobic because you had an extra wet pocket. Maybe it's gone anaerobic because you put stuff in there that that is, like some meat or something like that. And you're like, oh, I'm not going to do that anymore. Other manures like cat or dog manures are definitely a no-no just because of the pathogens that they can produce. Can you compost manures? Of course, but don't put it in the compost that you're going to use to grow food or that you're going to, maybe have flowers and things. If you're going to compost questionable material, have it separate. Make sure you've got plenty of carbon for it and, keep it out of your regular compost. I'm going to try to have a heat surge that's going to kill any pathogens, but I also want to be aware of what I put in there and make sure that it's safe. So I'm going to get started here with this compost. This isn't quite enough to turn in to the other side. So I'm just going to use it as a base for my next pile. So we talked a little bit about the compostable bags. This lid from Eco Products also claims to be compostable. So it's been in there since July. It's kind of starting to break down. I don't really want this plastic anyway. I mean, it is still plastic, even though it's made from cellulose. It's probably made from corn starch or something like that. I really don't want it in my compost and it doesn't break down. So goodbye. But all this other stuff though, what I'm going to start out with, I think, is this beautiful coffee and
Oh no.
Okay. Can you compost paper? Absolutely. Glossy paper? No, not so much. Okay, so that's a beautiful mix right there. You can see that it's already a little wet. One of the beauties of these 3-tiered bins, again, as I said, I am about 5 feet tall, so I can get in there and bend and get as deep as I want to. And as the compost pile builds up, I can build, build a wall.
Not that kind of wall.
Yeah, right. I can build a barrier so that the compost inside, the compostable material inside doesn't fall out. So now I'm going to add my veggie scraps. Oop, this cardboard wants to fall apart. So sorry to all the flies that have set up house here. It didn't take long. I brought this over on Sunday. So yeah, so it's super wet from all that nitrogen and it's got a bit of a smell. We've got some collards in here, that cabbagey smell, that sulfur smell, and we have some tissue paper. So people ask if they can add paper towels and other materials, and yeah, you can, but paper towels are actually coated with a wet strength additive so that when it gets wet, they actually get stronger. That's why you see the ads with the where you can like hold a bowling ball or something crazy with a wet paper towel. So they actually resist decomposition. If you get them good and wet, you tear them up. You want to put them in your compost for the carbon. If that's what you got, then go ahead and do it. But it's not the best. My other favorite composting tool is this edger. The reason for that is because you can go ahead and slice and dice all of the chunky materials and make it into the smaller pieces that will break down so beautifully. We want this carbon to be, or excuse me, this nitrogen to be in smaller pieces so that it can talk to the carbon. So you can see that I'm turning, there's a produce sticker. Oh. See, so this chopping, I also like that tomatillo, goodbye, into pieces. I also like using a broken hoe, you know, just the hoe part as a chopper. A friend of mine even sharpens hers. So you can really get in there and chop it into small pieces. If you are running a community garden, you're probably going to be deadheading and doing other things too. You probably want to get a really good pair of gardening shears, something really sharp, so that you can chop the sturdy stems of plants that you've weeded out or deadheaded. Do you want to put weeds in here? Probably not, especially if they have the seed head still attached, because then hopefully you got a hot pile that'll kill those weed seeds, but just in case you don't, you're going to be sowing weeds in your garden, and nobody wants that. If you are too late and you're weeding and the weed seeds have already sprouted, you can use it as a mulch. Like, go ahead and spread out some cardboard, spread the weeds out on top of it. If you want to expand your garden, if there's some place where you actually want to kill the weeds down below, let it sit. You can even cover it with cardboard and create a little cardboard sandwich with the weeds in between. Crickets and other seed-eating insects will go in there and they will eat the weed seeds. And as it breaks down and shrivels up, then eventually you can add it. You can just dish it into the ground or add it to a compost when those seeds have either shaken off or been consumed. But other than that, those fibrous plants, they resist decomposition. You have to chop them up so that you can get to the fibrous interior. So you want to chop it into smaller pieces, and shears are a big help for that. So moving on, I'm going to go ahead and add my manure. Just get that in there. Remember, I only want it to be about 8% of the full thing. So I'm layering it in, I'm dishing it in. And we may not teach another class here for another 6 months. You know what I mean? So yeah. So I feel like, hopefully it'll be okay. I don't know. I mean, I'm really concerned about the herbicide issue, so I might actually move away from doing manures just to be on the safe side. But other manure, chicken manure is really smelly, and it's loaded with nitrogen, loaded with urea, a great addition, but it's super stinky, so I avoid it for that reason. And cow manure, also a great source of nitrogen, but you have to go out in the field and kind of cherry pick it. Horse manure, generally they have a muck out pile, and it's got that great sawdust or wood chips from the bedding. So that's why I prefer horse manure over other types. So now I'm going to add, let's see. It looks pretty wet to me at this juncture. So I'm not going to add any water just yet. Oh, talk about kitchen containers. Watch this.
Look at this, Dad.
Yeah. So I did say 3 by 3. So you need a lot of volume to get that density, to get the oh gosh, what's the word? The mass required for that heat surge. So you need a lot of material. So when you're starting your compost, don't be shy. So this cup also says that it's compostable. I happen to know that it's got a compostable plastic liner, which is great, but you know what? I don't really want that in my compost today. If I was a commercial composter, I would be okay with it, but I'm not. I'm a backyard composter, and so I'm gonna leave it out. So My
feel so-
gloves.
Looks like they're
Are over
It's like-
there.
You want me to here?
No,
I'll-
no, no.
in here, not.
What's that, Tania?
Oh, I thought the connection's a little bit choppy, but I think we're back on.
Okay.
So, oh my gosh, this gorgeous fennel.
Mm.
Oh, it smells so nice. So, just gonna make this bag a little lighter so that I can actually pick it up. But all of this, oh, and look, a kind surprise. So this cardboard, look how tiny the fibers are, and it is literally just falling apart in my hand. So I feel okay about leaving this in there. It's an organic grocer, came from an organic grocery. I'm gonna leave that in. Number one, because I need more carbon. You see all this nitrogen? I need that carbon inside this pile. So I'm gonna leave that in. If you don't have access to a grocer, now this is where your neighbors come in handy. You want to tell them, I'm going to start a compost and I want all of your fruit and veggie scraps. Look at this. Like, that ginger, are you kidding me?
I want to like pull it out and juice it.
I mean, is that wrong?
Same with the fennel. That's why you wash your fruits and vegetables.
That's
Good.
right. That's what water's for. So I am making quick work of these lettuce heads. But you know what? The bugs are going to love this. But I want to toss in that manure that I just put in. I probably should have put that on top. So here I am turning my pile. So a lot of people are like, oh, it's so hard. I don't have a gym membership.
You don't need
I have a compost pile. But this pitchfork is actually just such a great tool. It really, it lifts and it fluffs up the material just beautifully. So I'm already getting down into where the manure and the coffee grounds are and mixing it all together. Because that's what I want. I want the different densities to be mixed together. I'm even pulling up some of the compost from down below that has worms and things in it. So they're going to go to town on this as well. So it's not bad if you mix a little bit of the old compost that's down the bottom with the fresh material on top, because you're just getting those microbes excited with the oxygen and the fresh material. And the worms are going to get excited because they have all those microbes to eat. So this is how we create a beautiful, beautiful soil ecosystem that'll be converted into your garden. All right. So those of you who are paying attention will be looking at this and say, girl, you got no carbon in there. That's gonna smell, that's gonna stink, and you're right. So I'm gonna add some carbon. Before I do that, I'm gonna add put another brick in the wall here. Oh, I keep doing that. I keep grabbing the short one. There we go. So this is my mix of grass and leaves. See? Oh,
look at all the pine needles.
Look at all the pine needles. That's what I'm talking about. Wah, wah. The surprise inside. So
More mulch.
case in point. Oh, there you go. That's right. More mulch. So I'm just going to put that down over here because that will make a great mulch. These sticks, I mean, they're not going to hurt anything. They certainly create more space and aeration but I don't want many. You know what you really want to do, like, so if you have a yard and you're producing all of this kind of woody material, before I went ahead and got my yard waste bin from the city and, you know, they started collecting it at my curb, this is the kind of stuff that I would put in it, right? The stuff that doesn't really go very well in my compost, or that, you know, has seed heads on it or is too fibrous for it to be broken down in my backyard bin. But before that, I just made my own separate composter. I used the pallet style, four pallets in a cube. I didn't care how long it took to break down. I threw all kinds of stuff in there, sticks, twigs, logs. It does create habitat for some critters that you may not want. You know, it does, like if you've got dry wood that's just hanging out, then you know that can attract you know, lizards and frogs and rodents and things. And then if you've got that, then you can also attract snakes. So some people don't like that much. Personally, I'm like, I'm leaving it in there. I'm just throwing stuff on top. I don't care how long it breaks down. Once I get to where I actually want to move it, where it's broken down, I'm going to leave it for a good long while. I'm not going to put my hands in it. If they want to go to town and have their own little ecosystem, I'm not bothered by it. But that's me. Other people have their tolerances and lack thereof. So just be advised that if you know, you can also bring it to the Waste Disposal and Recycling Center just down the road here on Club Boulevard, and we'll mulch it and put it in with our biosolids and make gorgeous compost with it. So we have disposal features here in the city if you don't want it in your compost, which I most certainly do not right now. So, gonna kind of de-litter. But look at these leaves. These leaves are good. And you know what? These needles, I've got a needle in my leaf pile, needle in the haystack. They look like cedar or arborvitae. Oh, and there's that mold, that that fuss, but I put my hand on it and it's actually quite warm. So this is not bad to me. Maybe just take the obvious pine boughs out. So what we're going to end up with is compost and some needles. You know, there are worse things. And the pH will still be very close to neutral. But this is what I was saying, you know, it's like, know your source, know where it's coming from. You know, careful when you're pawing through. Wearing gloves, unlike I'm doing right this second, is probably really smart. In case you do come across something that's actually sharp and cut it. Because that could have just as easily been in there too. But here I am, I'm creating this mix. So now we're talking, right? Probably about 2 feet deep, about 2.5 feet across. Now we're talking. Now this is what is like a nursery. This is our baby compost. If I come back tomorrow and I stick my thermometer in here, so long as I get it wet enough, I fully expect that it's going to be around that 130 range. Just
no, something else.
Where's back here spreading germs?
Yourself.
Good for you.
Hey everyone, can you make sure that you're on mute? Looks like someone is not.
I like
Thank you.
All right. So for those of you who remember the 4 ingredients, when you look at this now, you may be like, hey, that looks kind of dry, doesn't it? It looks kind of dry and crusty. I mean, those lettuce leaves are going to break down, but they're really not going to, those brown leaves aren't going to get enough of that moisture. So I'm literally just going to water it. I'm going to water it like I do my garden. It gets dried out. This composter doesn't have a lid on it. If it did, it would help reduce some of the evaporation, but these screen sides are really going to let in a lot of air. So that's why after a couple weeks, you maybe want to flip it or just go ahead and turn it and water it excite those microbes all over again. They're going to get the raw material that didn't break down on the edges. Once it gets watered down again, it's going to be reactivated, and the microbes can go to town all over again. But they need you. They need you to help it along. If you're going to do a community garden, you need someone who is going to be the guide, going to steward, going to make sure that, you know, someone at Halloween doesn't just throw their pumpkin on top and leave it, because that will attract mice, that will attract flies, and it's going to smell. You need to make sure that someone knows they need to chop that into little pieces. You know, go ahead and work it in with brown leaves and leave a brown shell on top. You know, if you set up a collection site where there's a barrel outside where people bring their organic scraps, you need to make sure that they know to not put any plastic or produce labels, or you know, if they bring their material in a bag, to make sure that they debag it first, like all of those little details. When you've got a community pile, when you've got a lot of people that are working on the same location, everybody needs to be following by the same rules, or you need one person that is absolutely going to captain that ship and make sure that it runs smoothly, because it's going to take one rat, it's going to take one, you know, odoriferous afternoon where the wrong person is walking by to smell it going south, or see the flies coming off it or something like that, and it's going to shut it down. And so you want to make sure that you have an aesthetic pile, one that I just showed you where there's no odor. Yeah, we're breaking down all kinds of food scraps. All kinds of things are in here. We're going to make beautiful soil to add to my community garden. But you have to make sure that someone that knows what they're doing or is willing to learn and stay with it. And if, you know, you move on, then have someone else take their place. I've done a little bit of work with community gardens, and those are probably the biggest issues, is that, you know, the person that started it with all of the energy and enthusiasm, and then they move. You know, the kids grow up and they're, you know, they go off to college and then they leave, you know, things like that. But speaking of classrooms, if you want an outdoor classroom, if you want to talk about soil ecology, chemistry, this is a great place to test pH. It's a great place to test moisture balance, bulk density. Like there's all these scientific studies that you can do with compost to, you know, enrich young minds and get them thinking about science. You know, biodiversity, you know, entomology, all of these incredible sciences are encapsulated also in the practice of composting, although it is also a lot of fun, in my opinion. All right, so we've got kind of, how's that looking, Mariel? She's my eyes on the ground.
I mean, it looks wet.
It looks wet. We've got this great mix. Look how the carbon and the nitrogen are kind of, you know, sticking together. We've got the evil produce sticker always present. Yeah, I think it's looking pretty good. What have I got left? I've got
Muriel, we have a couple questions too.
Okay, bring them on.
There's a question about rain on the open bins and or I think the closed bin, the one with the lid as well. And then also a question about composting pet waste. And do you have to do anything with the manure before you put it in the compost?
Great. Okay. So no, I didn't do anything with the manure. I asked, they know me, but you know, farm etiquette requires that you let the farmer know that you're coming to steal some of his poop or her poop. No one's going to be like, stop, thief.
I wanted that poop.
I wanted that for mine because my horse is going to make another 80 pounds today. So no, I didn't do anything to it. Like I said, I do know the farmer, so he's not surprised, or his staff's not surprised when they see me pull up and start, you know, taking stuff off their manure pile. And as a matter of fact, he has a 3-tiered bin very similar to this, only it's made of concrete and it's about 3 times the size. So each of the bunker is like 3 times as big, and he uses a bobcat with a bucket on it to turn it. Same principle. You know, carbon nitrogen mix. He even puts his mortalities in there, you know, the chickens that die and things like that. You know, I mean, it happens. It's a
yeah, of course.
And he actually puts his mortalities in there and just mixes it in and, you know, keeps it on farm. So so it works. But other than that, you know, no, I didn't do anything to the manure. Pet manures, like you know, dog and cat manures, they can carry some pretty gnarly pathogens. So you definitely want to keep them out of your your kitchen compost that you're going to use in your garden. They will break down. I mean, some ways that you can manage it is just to bury it and cover it. There are anaerobic digesters that you can buy. They do require really good drainage. So if you're going to buy one of those for a pet waste decomposer, you need to essentially dig like a 6-foot pit for it and line it with gravel, make sure that it's going to drain. It's a project, but if you're going to have animals and you want to not throw away their pet waste, that's kind of what you need to do. I was on a call last night where someone brought this up, and you know, I'm kind of thinking in my mind, it's like, well, it's a deal that we make. I've got cats. It's probably one of the environmental crimes in my household is that I bag up their kitty litter with their poops and I throw it out. But you know what? I'm composting just about everything else. I'm teaching compost, so hopefully you'll go home and divert all of this food waste out of your kitchen and make beautiful brown gold for your garden, so you don't have to add any pesticides or herbicides or any other chemicals, because the plants are healthy enough to fight those off themselves. The soil is healthy enough to, with the diverse microbiome that, you know, those pests don't thrive. You're, you know, reducing erosion, so you're helping to protect our waters. Like, you're doing so much just by the act of composting. I feel like my little environmental crime with my little, you know, kitties, it's a little minor, but I also give money to spay and neutering programs. So there are a lot of cats and dogs that are, you know, homeless and, you know, don't have those comforts. So, you know, I think environmentalism is a series of trade-offs. If you want to compost your manures, just be really careful, be mindful, because those pathogens are, you know, they're real. They're real and they can be dangerous. So keep it separate, keep it away from any water supplies, bury it really well. Or if you're going to use like one of these Darth Vader helmets to break down your dog waste or something like that, make sure that you have buku's amount of carbon to break it down and cut those smells, because that will smell and your neighbors will know and they'll tell you about it.
And then the other question was about rain on the open compost.
Thank you. That's right. So, so what's going to happen? We're going to probably get some torrential downpours this winter, because that's North Carolina. And so that's going to actually flush a lot of the nutrients out into the ground beneath it. So one of the reasons why I like a hot compost and I like to be able to turn it quickly is because it locks those nutrients in. So even if it does get wet, it also gets what they call hydrophilic, and it'll shed water off the top. So when you've got a fixed compost, if you've got a finished compost pile, like in that third tier back there, it's actually going to shed the compost. If you've got a raw pile, you might want to cover it up. I would prefer a lid on this, but we haven't gotten there yet with this container. So you might just want to shelter it with, you know, a layer of really good brown leaves, cover it up like a lid like that, or cardboard or newspaper or something like that. Leaving it open to the rain. If it's really dry, if you haven't watered it with a hose lately and you want to really saturate it with water, leave it open and let the rain do the job. You know, for my part, I feel like the nitrogen is going to release a lot of moisture. So the enclosed containers, you really don't need to water it that much. I do, because it dries around the exterior, but it's still got that wet interior that's going pretty good. If you have a good balance of nitrogen, it's going to release a lot of moisture, especially like, you know, around here, you know, zucchini and cucumbers. I have a fig tree. Oh my gosh, the moisture that comes off of those fruits when I compost them is really tremendous. So, you know, I inoculate my bin with water with what I put in it. You know, the heat comes from within rather than the sun, so I can put it in the shade so it doesn't dry out. The bigger problem of, you know, composting not working is that it gets too dry, because the microbes need that moisture in order to live. So you know, if you're not adding enough nitrogen, or if it's too dry for some other reason, then leave the lid off and let the rainwater hit it. Otherwise, you know, going back to your kitchen, you know, you might want to use a variety of containers for your kitchen scraps. These are available online. A lot of composters sell them. It's kind of just a cheap plastic container. I use one of these for a long, long time. I like it because it's got hooks in the back and you can hang it in your like your under sink cabinet and just have that door open. So, you know, when you're cooking, you can drop things right inside. So this is a nice design for that reason. But it is just cheap plastic. If you don't want to buy cheap plastic, guess what? You can probably get it at the grocery store and when you're done with your food. I also didn't mind putting all my produce labels on this ice cream container. It's small. It's not very beautiful. So when I was at the scrap exchange thrift store and I saw this little baby, I was like, come home to mama. It's my little composter that I have at home. So you can see I'm really into the clementines. What is it with avocados? Yesterday it wasn't ripe, and then the next day it's overripe. I mean, you got to be on top of it. Was I talking about food waste earlier? Anyway, so there's no hope for that. I'm just going to peel that sticker off and go ahead and stick a fork in it, because it's going to be really hard for the microbes to get in there with this really hard skin. It's designed to deflect decomposition and to fight off microbes. So you got to break into it to get to that juicy interior that the bugs love. Okay, so in my house though, as you can see, I'm also a big time coffee drinker. Before I carry this out to my bin, I'm going to fill it up with water and carry it out, and swoosh, it's going to need a rinse anyway, right? Before I bring it back into my kitchen. So might as well fill it up with water, bring that water out to my container. So I'm watering and feeding at the same time. It's a great hit for the microbes. So I hope that helps. And we covered that portion of the class as well.
Yay.
All right, so let me dig in my manual here.
Yeah, and my phone battery is getting a little low. So.
Okay, so we're gonna have to wrap it up. Any other questions before I put a lid on this one?
We have a question about pea shells, whether they were nitrogen or carbon. And I think maybe if you could just tell us the best source for determining whether your item is carbon, nitrogen, or keep it out of the compost.
Okay, well, so brown waste, carbon waste is brown woody material. Brown leaves, wood shavings, sawdust, paper. All comes from trees. It's all dry. That's your carbon source. Paper, coffee filters, that's carbon. Nitrogen is fresh vegetative waste, or like in the case of horse manure, they ate fresh vegetative waste. You know, we don't want the cat manure because they eat meat. Different animal. So those are your basic carbon nitrogen sources. When you start to get funky, like, let's see, I'll throw some at you. Wood ash, you would think carbon. Yes. However, it's very alkaline. Can you add wood ash to your compost? Yes, but I would do it in very, very small doses, because that alkalinity will kill your microbes. They really don't like it alkaline, and the potash is very alkaline. If you get a soil test and you find that your soil is very acidic, I would dish the potash directly into the soil and then put compost on top of it. Keep your compost alive with the microbes, keep the potash out. If you add a little bit, not a bad thing. Dryer lint, I have also seen that on lists. And if all you wear is natural fibers like silk, wool, cotton, then by all means compost your dryer lint. Otherwise, you've got plastic in there from all the polyester that we're all wearing all the time, actually. So keep that dryer lint out. I see it on lists from time to time. I'm not sure if it's considered, I guess it would be considered a carbon, right? It's dry. All the moisture's, I don't know. I just don't, I'm not in the natural fiber community 100% yet. I try, but I also use a clothesline because I'm that girl. So, so that's, that's something that I tend to avoid. But as far as sources go, you can Google also your carbon to nitrogen ratio. Google is our friend. It's like, is ... is my pineapple crown carbon or nitrogen? It's nitrogen, but it's also very pithy and extremely hard to decompose. So you're going to want to add a lot of carbon to help break that down. So you're going to learn by doing. If it's wet and stinky, you need more carbon. Brown leaves, wood chips are a good way to go. If you use wood chips, know that it's got a much higher carbon and nitrogen ratio. It's much sturdier. It's going to take a lot more nitrogen to actually break that down to where you can use it as compost. Google's your friend, but also so is experience. You just have to practice. You just have to play with it. Your compost will tell you if it's not right. What you want in your finished compost is a cool, earthy smelling, brown, crumbly, soil-like material. And, you know, once you've got that, go ahead and dish it into the dirt. Yeah, I hope that answers that question.
I think it does, yeah. And I think you've answered all the questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Great.
So I'm just gonna, I'm gonna finish with the cap of leaves from my house. Cover this up because I really don't want any critters coming. See, nobody knows what happens
just
in the
a pile
compost
of
pile
leaves.
stays in the compost pile. I'm gonna water it down nice and gentle so I don't wash my leaves away. Oh, one thing I didn't talk about, ants. Ants can be a problem in a compost. I talked about flies, but then I didn't talk about ants. And if you're turning your compost, ants won't like it. They don't like to be disturbed. Neither do mosquitoes. Even if it's wet, 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 if you're turning it all the time, you won't have a problem with either one of those pests. And all the time, I mean like once, like every couple of weeks. All the time. If you don't let it rest, it's not going to break down either. So don't go crazy and turn it all the time. But for this pile, so if when I want to add fresh material, I can just dig a hole in the center where I know that there's the density, the moisture, the microbes. I'm going to dig a hole in the center, plop my raw material in there, maybe with a little swish of water, cover it back up with carbon, turn in that dry exterior, put it on top, right? And you can actually create your own digester where you're just adding fresh material to the center, curling the dry exterior back into the middle, feeding the center, turning and turning and turning. That bottom layer is going to be composting, and you can scoop it out of the door if you've got the Darth Vader style, or just go ahead and drop it into the next container and let it cure there. Build your fresh pile here, flip it again. Anything that's not broken down, put it back in the first time till it's done. Yeah, that's that on that. So
Great.
Thank you. I think that's it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. As we mentioned, we are going to send you a post event survey. It's only a couple of questions, and by completing it, you will be entered into a raffle to win one of these brand new fantastic composting bins. So please fill that out when you receive it. And yeah, if you have any questions after this, Muriel is an excellent resource, as is Tania.
Happy to help. Thank you so
That's it.
much.
Thanks
really
for
been a
coming
pleasure.
today, everyone. Bye. Okay, let's end this.